Hello and welcome again to History Biscuits.
Hello.
Hello.
Yay.
Hope exams are treating you well.
They're treating us very well.
Very well. So this week we are going to look at civil rights under Kennedy and Johnson.
Yeah.
Which we haven't done.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
We've done a one with Truman and Eisenhower. A combo.
We did. So this time we're going to do the same, and we're going to do an essay question, which is a comparison because we know that students hate them.
Yeah, and it was actually really hard.
It was really, really hard.
And we even used the mark scheme because it is an AQA question.
And it didn't really help.
Nope, as usual. But anyway,
yeah.
Well, apart from that.
Yeah, it was all good. You're going to enjoy yourselves.
So we'll just do a bit of a rundown.
As always. So we'll start with, let's do civil rights under Kennedy. I'll start with the easy one. Legislation under Kennedy for civil rights.
0.
Yeah, 0. Kind of a few executive orders to kind of symbolic gestures.
Go on.
Oh, now you put me under pressure. He hires more African-American federal judges.
Yes.
Such as Thurgood Marshall is a federal judge, not Supreme Court judge yet. He invites more African-Americans to the White House for tea and things, which is very symbolic, but it's not actual legislation.
And also, what was the problem with the federal judges?
Some were segregationists.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So whilst there was some progress, also very questionable other things
that
he did.
There's some bad choices.
Don't forget that to counter.
But symbolic and
proactive. So when we look at protests that are happening during that time, Kennedy is different to Eisenhower, who was much more reactive, much more slow on the uptake. Kennedy responds more actively.
He does, but he doesn't.
Go on.
Time. The idea being he is very limited. You've got to remember with Kennedy, he barely wins the election, which means that he maybe isn't as proactive as we would expect, as a lot of African Americans expect him to be.
Yeah. But certainly more than Eisenhower.
Oh yeah, but that's not saying much.
But it's still something.
True. So protests that Kennedy is not involved with, but happened during his presidency. We've obviously got the freedom rides.
Yeah, in 61.
Indeed. Which end in violence, but are very, very kind of proactive in terms of getting media coverage for the kind of barbaric treatment of those people who participate in it as well.
Yeah.
We've got James Meredith. I'm doing these in a random order.
Yeah.
I realise this.
62.
Indeed. Trying to get into the University of Mississippi.
Yes.
Is prevented, is kind of a student who is the ideal student for it, and because the university is segregationist, they do not allow him to go in.
Yeah.
So you get that Kennedy gets his brother, Bobby Kennedy, to send in, is it federal guards?
Yeah.
To help 200 of them. Some of them get injured trying to get him into the building, and again
because there's rioting and the fact that he's there. Yeah,
and it's symbolic that he's kind of saying back off a little bit.
Yeah, and then you've also got the same thing as Bobby Kennedy again with freedom rides.
Yeah.
That it's him that's responding and helping to protect those travelling through Alabama. The only problem is it's not necessarily Kennedy that's doing it, but it is his administration. He's keeping distance between it.
And Kennedy doesn't like the freedom rides.
No.
This is where we get to swear on the podcast.
The first swear.
I know. What does he describe the freedom rides as?
You tell me.
Unpatriotic sons of bitches.
Oh my word.
I know.
I really thought you were going to go another way there. I'm glad you didn't.
Okay, but so the idea being that Kennedy might not technically support this. I think he's aware that it's making America look bad internationally, which is making him look bad.
Yeah, and I think that's something you can counter in terms of what his motives really were. And I think that's another thing to remember as well, that Kennedy, he is in support of civil rights in his election campaign, but he becomes more supportive by 63. The first 2 years are a little bit meh because of that narrow election victory. He's trying to keep everyone on side because he doesn't have much experience. He's not like Johnson, who can be belligerent and pushing for things. He's worried about making sure he can get re-elected.
And you've also got by 63 that the momentum behind the civil rights movement is really building, so it means that he can't ignore things. When you're looking at things like the Albany campaign, which doesn't go great for the civil rights movement in the fact that Pritchett is fairly educated,
well researched,
so he's able to kind of nip the protest in the bud, as it were. Then you've got Birmingham, where Bull Connor really kind of highlights how ignorant the South is. Is that the wrong thing to say?
No.
If anyone's listening in America, it might sound bad. I don't think anyone is.
It's at the time. It's
at the time, obviously. That's, sorry, America.
But also a really good example of how the protests work and get that attention that's needed to make sure that legislation can start to be passed, because that's when Kennedy's really, really suddenly much more aware of actually how awful.
Yeah, and the pressure builds, and the media coverage of Birmingham in particular raises that public awareness, meaning that, you know, people are outraged, and if they're outraged, they suddenly want to do something about it.
Yeah.
Which then leads to the March on Washington.
Yeah, which is a much more sedate affair.
Indeed.
It's
They're worried
peaceful.
it's going to get violent.
Yeah.
But actually you've got 250,000 individuals marching peacefully, listening to songs, kind of speeches.
And it's a mixture of kind of white and ethnic minorities taking part.
Yeah.
So it shows that there is a lot of support for it. And it's not just about race either, it is about jobs as well, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of coming back to that idea of the new frontier with the poverty element to it.
Yeah.
And that again is another thing that Kennedy can use to justify pushing for more civil rights acts and tries to get something through in Congress. But I think it's probably worth just coming back to Birmingham to say about the fact that there wasn't a massive amount that he really did in response to that.
He goes on TV and calls it...
denounces it.
Yeah, denounces it, but doesn't really do anything. I think he suggests he's going to put in a curfew.
Yeah, if it gets to that point. But luckily after like 8 days they start to have discussions, don't they? There are federal guards on standby, but George Wallace is making sure that they don't ever get mobilised, because he thinks that, again, it would be Kennedy like overstepping the mark in terms of states' rights. Kennedy's not been too worried about that prior with like James Meredith and Freedom Rides, which was because of that precedent that was set by Eisenhower. But it shows that he's more proactive.
Yeah, and I think George Wallace is a different kettle of fish, really, isn't he? The fact that he loves a bit of publicity. I think Kennedy is aware that he will use it to his own benefit if he were to federalise the Guard.
Yeah, because he's a Democrat as well.
Yeah,
even though you wouldn't think it.
You wouldn't think it at all.
And he needs the South on side.
Indeed. So that's kind of Kennedy.
Yeah.
Obviously, the legislation that he says he's going to put through after the March on Washington gets so delayed that it's still in Congress when he dies. So we'll start with civil rights under Johnson. The biggest part of legislation is what?
The Civil Rights Act of 64.
Indeed, and he's able to use Kennedy's legacy to pass that act, and it's kind of one of the first things that he does, isn't it? So he's able to get that passed in 64. The Civil Rights Act essentially ends the Jim Crow laws, you could argue.
Yeah, and I think the Voting Rights Act does it even more so, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think what you've got with the Civil Rights Act is that it ends the Jim Crow laws, but it doesn't necessarily fix the voting problem in the fact of the poll tax. You've also got the literacy test, so that's where the Voting Rights Act has to come in 65 to kind of sweep it up and make sure that it is equality across the board.
Yeah, and there's debates about that, isn't there? Like, there's quite a few films about Johnson's motives behind it. Like, was it on purpose or was it weakened?
Yeah.
Did he weaken it so that he could get it passed? Empathise.
Yeah, and I think you use that momentum to gain forward, and then you've got with the Voting Rights Act, he's under pressure from the Selma March.
Yeah.
And the humiliation that brought of seeing people beat on the streets.
Yeah.
For it as well, so that changes the game a little bit.
It definitely applies the pressure, doesn't it? It makes him do it earlier than perhaps he was planning on doing.
Yeah.
And then you've got a bit of a change, really, because you've got those two really, really historic bits of legislation that is and we'll look at this in the question, for many people this is like, well, that's it then, it's done, sorted, even though it obviously isn't, because it starts to really just de jure segregation. So Martin Luther King moves to the north and starts to look at the housing problem in Chicago in 66.
Yeah, trying to deal with the issue of de facto segregation, which is a much harder thing to build, kind of deal with, because it's so embedded in society and the economy and everything else like this as well. So the Chicago kind of policy doesn't work well at all.
Daley like takes advantage of it, looks like he's helping, and then just nothing comes of it, and he has to just leave.
And you've got Martin Luther King also is then resented as well by the people of Chicago, in the fact that he's seen kind of as a phony individual who's come in to sweep up the glory, and he doesn't live in the same area, and he's very much seen as being a southern person who has dealt with a southern problem. So he's not really welcomed with open arms when he gets to Chicago.
No, and then it's much more evident then, I guess, to civil rights groups, maybe not enough to politicians, and certainly not to kind of the white voters, that this is actually a real problem, and it's going to be much, much harder to fix. It's much more ingrained into social attitudes. There's no legislation really that's going to help much.
Yeah, and I suppose Chicago's quite a good step forward in regards to the radicalisation of civil rights groups that come after the Civil Rights Act.
Because they're frustrated.
Yeah, that frustration that's come about during that as well. So you get that with SNCC.
Yeah.
Not so much with the SLCC, the Southern...
SCLC.
That's the one.
Oh.
I know. Look at that.
How dare you.
I know. Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Well
I'll
done.
compensate that way. Compensate that way.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Okay, let's not do this game. This is a rubbish game.
It's a bit boring for everyone listening.
It's really bad. So the radicalisation of civil rights groups at that time, which will kind of build up of, northern frustration. You had that earlier with Malcolm X.
Yeah.
And then later on, obviously, with that Black Panther movement and things like this as well.
Yeah. So then you get, obviously, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And again, that's intensifying that frustration that we're talking about, that radicalisation that's happening with civil rights groups. But again, Johnson uses that as an opportunity to pass legislation and the Housing Act in 1968. The problem with the Housing Act is doesn't really have much support.
Doesn't do anything
He's
at all.
funneling lots of money into Vietnam, and therefore no one really wants to support it with tax, because they just think, what do you need the money for? It's not my concern.
And I think you've got, once the Vietnam War kicks off, priorities in America do change in civil rights as well. If it's very much the idea of, well, you got what you wanted the end of Jim Crow laws, you've got it, what's your problem?
They're not really understanding the
wider issue.
At home.
There you go. So that's kind of taken us on a journey.
A small, tiny journey.
Between civil rights of Kennedy, a tiny journey. Kennedy and Johnson and the civil rights. So what we've done, as always, is we've found an exam question, and we found quite a mean one this week. And as we said at the beginning, it has taken us a while to plan, which means it is a nasty, nasty one. And we, at one stage, thought, we're not going to do this question because it's horrible.
But we didn't.
But we didn't give up.
Because we persisted and we thought,
resilient.
We've got to show that we can do this.
Indeed. And we didn't argue this time either, which was
this
good.
time either.
No, we didn't.
We didn't.
No, it's never normally a bicker before.
Exactly. What do you mean? Don't know what you mean by either. Right, this time.
If anyone listens to is it the Kennedy one?
Yeah, when I tell everyone that we argued.
Yeah. Oh, good. So the question we've gone with is one from a specimen question. So I think it's specimen 2014 from the exam board, and it's in the years 61 to 68, the campaigns to advance the civil rights of African Americans made only limited progress in the face of bitter opposition. Assess the validity of this view. Now, I would imagine
you're going to have to look at certain words.
I know, because it's a big question and you probably stop listening part way through.
That's an essay in itself.
Indeed. So we've got our years of 61 to 68. I think you've got to
So what might
that
be?
Well, that's going to be Kennedy
and Johnson. Good job.
Let's not do that together again.
That was fun.
That wasn't good. Then you've got campaigns to advance the civil rights of African Americans. So you're kind of talking about, well, what campaigns? What are we talking about by that?
What are the methods? What are the approaches?
Yeah, and then you've got
by whom?
Made only limited progress. So I suppose that's going to be a key word of progress. What are we looking for here?
And it wasn't much.
And it wasn't much. And then you've obviously got bitter.
In the face of bitter opposition. So essentially the reason why there was very little progress was because of all the opposition, and it was bitter.
Yeah. Do you want me to repeat the question again? Because
yeah, let's do that.
Okay. In the years 61 to 68, the campaigns to advance the civil rights of African Americans made only limited progress in the face of bitter opposition. Assess the validity of this view.
Yeah. So, in terms of our factors and our themes, our points of arguments, as it were, this was where we kind of got a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe we overthought it.
I think we did overthink it.
Because we're just so good at planning essays.
You see, and it's just one of those. So, where have we decided to start on this one?
We decided to start on the disagree side.
Obviously.
And looking at legislation.
Yeah. Because I think if you're talking about progress in civil rights between 61 and 68, I think the biggest thing you're going to talk about is legislation in progress.
Yeah. Should we say what the other factors are that we're going to go on to and then come back to it?
Should we do that?
Just so that we're really getting those factors in there. Yeah. So then we'll talk about this in a minute. The other factor we thought of was the progress in terms of social awareness, like how people are aware of the problems of African Americans.
Yeah.
And then the third strand we looked at, well, really we need to look at, is it because of bitter opposition? What are the other reasons for limited progress? So you're kind of getting an idea where we're going in terms of how much progress was being made. So if we start again then, looking at then legislation in terms of whether or not there was limited progress and whether it was in the face of bitter opposition.
Yeah. So I think if we start on the disagree side, we're going to go with there was progress.
Because of legislation. And legislation was...
Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. These were historical, significant legislation that was passed.
There was nothing like it prior to this. No, not as
huge.
Yeah, with such wide coverage.
And there was actually quite a significant amount of support for it, with the 64 Act gaining 68% of public support.
Yeah, so that would be challenging that idea about whether there is actually limited progress because you've got support publicly.
Yeah. But at the same time, even though there's public support for it, what we actually find is there's also bitter opposition to it, such as?
In Congress.
Yeah.
So you've got the Dixiecrats causing problems again, that I guess Kennedy was dealing with when he was trying to get stuff through in 64. So the fact that they filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 64 for 54 days. So that's essentially just standing there for 54 days going,
it's really boring.
I don't want this to go through, and all the reasons why, and then eventually it got stopped.
Yeah, and you've also got the bitter opposition to the Civil Rights Act, which is the division of the Democrat Party.
Yeah.
You know, you could argue the election in 68 is lost because of this. You know, you've got people like George Wallace who take advantage of the situation and break away and become independents. And the idea being that the Civil Rights Act of 64 changes the Democrat Party really significantly.
Yeah, from then on, they've lost the South.
Yeah.
And Johnson says, you know, by doing that, they're going to. And that is really where the flip has fully happened now, that the South vote Republican. And George Wallace being that independent in 1968 really, really damages the Democrat Party for Hubert Humphrey. And lots of other reasons as well. But there is an argument to say, but that is quite marginalised, the extremes of it. But it does have a damaging effect. So I wouldn't go too heavy on that side, because there is clearly opposition in that regard. But it's more political. Okay, so then we've got other legislation such as the fact that the Housing Act in 68. So to try and show that there was some progress, you could talk about the fact that that is passed.
Yeah.
But like we said before, it's very weak. Yeah,
and again, it's that side of, well, you could argue on the opposition side that he's only able to get that through because of the death of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, it's only because of that he even tries to do it.
And it's so watered down, there's not a huge amount of support for it. So even though it is progress, it is limited in what it's doing, and you could argue that's down to the bitter opposition that he's facing.
That those white taxpayers don't want to pay for better housing because it doesn't apply to them. Yeah.
So that's kind of our legislation argument in terms of the limited progress and bitter opposition as to whether that's the explanation for it or not. Yeah. The next one we're going to look at is the social awareness. Yeah. And the social capacity.
Yeah, whether people are now more in support of it, has all those campaigns by the civil rights.
Yeah, and if we're looking in the years 61 to 68, one of the major awareness regarding civil rights and African American issues has been raised through things like the March on Washington, Birmingham campaigns, the Selma marches, of there is more support for these protests that are going forward.
Yeah, you've got those huge numbers that have really worked to pile the pressure on to get those acts passed in the first place. So you've got a good link there. You've got the awareness is raised, and that's why the legislation was passed in the first place.
And certainly towards the southern issues in particular of those Jim Crow laws, the de jure segregation, that outrage that is caused by this social awareness means that then the legislation can be passed.
Yeah, exactly.
To counter it?
To counter it, though.
Well, okay, so some people are aware of it and some people care about it, but actually there are urban riots during that time. You've also got, yes, there's an awareness of the southern situation, but the northern issue hasn't been raised in any way.
Yeah, so once the legislation's passed, you can talk about, and whilst awareness has been raised, once legislation's passed, people don't really see what the point is in the civil rights movement because they can't really get their heads around the de facto issues.
And this leads to more frustration amongst kind of everyone in society. Go on.
I was going to say, you can use the Kerner Commission perhaps in this as well, that highlights the fact that it has a damning conclusion that says something like that this country is moving towards a very separate black and white society, one that is unequal, essentially. And that should have been something that the next president should have been taking on and working with, and it often even students forget about it, but it really shows you that clearly you could argue that is therefore in writing that there's been limited progress by that time.
And there's bitter opposition.
Yeah.
So it ties directly back to that question for it as well.
Yeah. So then I think you can then talk about, well, what are the other reasons then? That kind of ties us into say, well, because of this frustration, you've got this radicalised civil rights movement that they can see that people think everything's been achieved and what are you whinging for? Why are you rioting? So you've got the changes in things like the SNCC leadership, the Black Panthers emerging, Nation of Islam, kind of the upset prior, I guess, with like Malcolm X. That also shows this radicalisation, and that the media are jumping on a little bit as well.
Yeah, and you then also got the fact as well of the limited progress in civil rights might not be bitter opposition, it might be the circumstances in America, such as the Vietnam War.
Yeah, so it's kind of coming back to the idea of those different groups. They're not cohesive, they're not working together, so that also means that the progress isn't happening. So the fact that they've radicalised and they don't really have a uniting cause anymore. And then, like you said, with Vietnam, the money that they would have wanted isn't there. Yeah,
and the focus and the attention as well of, that's suddenly gone. So it means that these groups do radicalise as well in the desperate attempt of trying to gain some kind of publicity.
Yeah, and in a way it becomes much more focused again back to kind of ethnic minorities. There is a push to move whites out in a way as well, which also doesn't help in terms of encouraging support. So I guess we can look at the judgment.
Indeed. So what would your judgment be for the question in the years 61 to 68? I bet you're sick of this question now. The campaigns to advance the civil rights of African Americans made only limited progress in the face of bitter opposition. Assess the validity of this view. What is your conclusion, Miss Lawrence?
Well, I thought that I would say that there has been progress, but it is limited. So agree to an extent, because by 65 you have got quite very significant historic acts, so you'd need to talk about why they are so significant, but it's limited. There isn't enough that's done post 65 really. You've got the 68 Housing Act, but it's too limited. So I think the challenge would be because of opposition, but I wouldn't say it's bitter anymore. By 68 people are apathetic.
Oh, fancy.
You've got a bit of, you've got everything now. There is perhaps a bitter element in terms of the response to the riots.
Yeah, I think, that changes it slightly, but you've got this idea that things have changed over the period of time anyway, so this idea of opposition has changed as well.
Yeah, clearly the riots show that there is more that needs to happen.
Right, so therein lies our essay plan. So I suppose that brings us on to the very important bit, the most important bit of the entire recording, the one everyone looks forward to and in no way cuts the listening off at this stage.
No, and we can't tell that at all.
I know. So...
Well, I'd like to ask you.
Alright, okay. Go on then.
I mean, I don't know if it's my 10 anymore. It's been a while since we've done one.
Okay.
So I think the main question would be... Johnson?
Yeah.
Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Okay.
He is coming to your house.
He is. Yeah.
He's going to be there in about an hour.
Oh, okay.
This is actually happening, by the way.
Yeah, okay.
This isn't a question.
This is quite scary now.
Yeah, it is. It would be quite...
It's really scary.
Yeah, how did it get there? And he has told me that he needs...
I'm quite concerned.
A hot drink.
The voices in your head of...
And he definitely needs some sugary biscuits.
Okay.
What would you do? Right. What would you do? What are you going to do?
He strikes me as someone who likes sugar in his life.
Well, he's told me he needs sugar. I'm not surprised.
Needs diabetic.
Is he?
I don't know. You say he needs it. I don't know if it's like a medical condition.
I think he's just a bit low.
Peckish.
Yeah.
He's got jet lag.
Yes.
This is taking a weird turn.
Imagine that, Lyndon Baines Johnson on a plane right now and he's just about to land.
Yeah, no,
then he's going to get a taxi to your house.
No,
he's going to be there.
I don't want to go home
in about 50 minutes.
Really don't want to go home now. So, hot drink wise, hot chocolate.
Yes.
Hot chocolate for him. Yeah. I think he'd like that.
Go for Cadbury's or like a Aldi's own.
I'd go Cadbury's. He's fancy. He's a president. Of course he needs Cadbury's.
And you can talk to him about how great Cadbury's is.
But not the one where you have to warm the milk. No one likes that.
With the skin on the top.
That's not nice.
But then you could do that because you don't really like him and you're scared and you want him to go away.
True. Or I could just not open the door and put the biscuits through the post box.
You do know who Johnson is. Okay. He's going to probably kick down your door.
Okay. Biscuit wise, I'm not a massive fan of Johnson. He doesn't deserve the Marks and Spencers.
You're giving him skin on hot chocolate at this point.
Indeed. Maybe.
He wants sugary biscuits.
He wants party rings. Because they're really disappointing.
You really need to get a better biscuit.
Party rings. Because they look impressive, but actually they are horrible. They are horrible. They taste of cardboard. And they're sugary.
Do you know what I think?
Come on.
Ice gems.
You had a different suggestion.
Well, I did. Dog biscuits.
Because he likes pulling dogs up by the ears.
And it would be like a very subtle...
Would you disguise the dog biscuits?
Yes. I'd dip it in something.
Would you eat the dog biscuits as well?
No. I'd just be like, oh, I've had
so you're going to have a separate
dinner at lunchtime. I'm all right.
Okay. This is one of our weirder ones.
I just like the idea of you like going home now and him possibly waiting there and going, oh, why have you been so long?
I don't think I'm ever going home.
No.
I think I live here now.
Yeah, no, you're not. No. Yeah.
Right. So on that wonderfully weird point that I'm sure everyone has stopped listening at,